We have to talk about the BBC because our national broadcaster is in a bit of hot water at the moment. An internal report has essentially exposed a Panorama documentary for having spliced up a Donald Trump speech on January 6th, essentially making it look like he very clearly incited violence when actually the two comments that he made were almost an hour apart in length. So this is really quite serious for our bastion of truth and impartiality. Benedict, do you think that this is the most outrageous example of Trump deranged media that we've seen?
Probably not the most outrageous, but they've sort of all disappeared into the background noise when you think about the sort of the sheer number and the number of people who've had to leave the BBC and then suddenly started their own podcast and have sort of daily meltdowns. And I think you have to sort of factor that into all of this. They may have left the BBC, but it's a bit like the Catholic Church, just leave. It's still part of the furniture up to a point. But it is a particularly egregious example. And I do sort of, if not just anything else, I'm sort of sat here wondering, where was BBC Verify in all of this? They literally have a sort of a truth department, which is supposed to at least be on top of this kind of propaganda. And they didn't have a line that would sort of come out and go, actually, this wasn't Panorama at all. It was the anonymous right-wing trolls. That's usually, of course, who they blame whenever they're asked to investigate anything. I tell you what, it's incredibly demoralizing. It's incredibly depressing because it doesn't have to be this way with the BBC. I don't think, there are lots of people who want the BBC to be sort of defunded, disbanded, they want to get rid of it. I'm not one of those people, though I do think the rot goes very deep. I think the brand recognition of the BBC and what it used to be once upon a time and what it still could offer in terms of unbiased news gathering, but also things like documentaries, as a sort of if you like, a sort of a leader of not the discussion, but simply of information in this country, and as a provider of information internationally as well. I think we really do lose sight of that sitting in the UK. How respected the BBC once upon a time was, and still is up to a point internationally, because in many parts of the world where they never had any pretense about having unbiased media, where it was the state broadcaster was the party broadcaster, and it was the big man in the big house telling you what was going on, and that was it. The BBC, with its multiple services in multiple different languages and its multiple correspondents around the world, was able to provide information to people that they could trust was relatively unbiased as you could hope to get, whilst recognizing that actually completely unbiased media is very difficult to achieve. That's gone. It's not a priority. The World Service and foreign language services, those are the things that get cut first and foremost, above everything else, whilst keeping a hold of nonsense, things like BBC Verify. That's the direction that the BBC has decided to go in now, and also as a provider of very cheap entertainment, very sort of lowbrow entertainment. I understand that sort of thing has a place, but actually, if that's what the BBC is going to become, then it should be commercialized and it should be competing with other commercial providers. I shouldn't have to pay for Strictly Come Dancing to be made. I just shouldn't. If I want to watch it, I can then pay, I don't know, a little bit, a subscription or something like that. But the fact that I would be prosecuted for not wishing for that to be made, or for any of the other program, is the Traitors of BBC thing? I have no idea. One hears of these things, and Claudia Winkleman is on it, so therefore I assume it is the BBC.
Yeah.
But who knows? But these sorts of programs, that I understand lots of people enjoy them, but they are commercial entertainment products. They should be allowed to compete freely. And the rest of the news production, I'm more than happy to pay for, and we should actually be happy to pay for, because, of course, in the event of a disaster or different news organizations going under, you do need sources of information. I think everybody could agree with that. But when it comes to this sort of thing, and as you say, Trump derangement syndrome, that sort of sense of, oh, well, he's this particular figure, and all of our mates kind of feel this way about him, therefore we can get away with it, and nobody's going to call us up on it. It just erodes that trust, and it makes it less likely that this utopia of mine will ever happen.
Tom, what are your thoughts on this whole debacle?
I just think the scale of the manipulation in that instance is outrageous. I mean, it is also worth remembering that the claims that Donald Trump particularly incited that mob, that when he gave that speech saying that we're going to fight like hell and so on and so forth, that was basically the pretext, not only to completely kind of damn him in the court of global polite society public opinion, even more so than he already had been. It was the pretext to say that he was a uniquely fascistic threat. It was the pretext basically to kick him off all of the major social media platforms. So the fact that the BBC was one factor in that whole attempt to suggest that not only did his supporters, his more kind of harebrained conspiratorial supporters, storm the Capitol on January 6, 2021, but that he basically ginned it up. He was someone who, were it not for him geeing up the mob, that would never have happened. So for the fact that the supposedly impartial BBC created this clip, I think is absolutely damning. It is a reminder, though, that the panic about post-truth misinformation, which has happened since Brexit and Trump's ascendancy in 2016, has been accompanied by a carnival of post-truth and misinformation amongst those very sections. I mean, immediately after Trump is elected, you have the Russiagate scandal, which goes on for months and months and months and months. There's still a majority of Democratic voters in America believe the 2016 election was basically stolen by Russia on behalf of Donald Trump, even though not a shred of evidence has ever been presented to prove this. Similarly, all kinds of things from the very early days of Trump's presidency onwards would suddenly circulate on social media, would suddenly percolate through the mainstream media as well, until a kind of very late in the day fact check was kind of quietly published somewhere in the newspaper suggesting that it wasn't true. So it is a reminder, at least, that for all the kind of pearl clutching that has existed, for all of the rise of BBC Verify, Mariana Spring, their sainted anti-disinformation correspondent, this would never have happened without the populist era. But that was explicitly, all these departments were explicitly created in response to the idea that voters went crazy in 2016, and if we're going to ever put the genie back in that bottle, we need to at length tell them where they're going wrong. And yet time and again they just end up producing their own misinformation. These things do happen. There are bad journalistic calls that are made. There are just malign journalistic calls that are made. People aren't perfect. People are subject to their own biases. But the sustained way in which that's taken place over the past few years, the BBC has gone beyond just having a kind of general liberal metropolitan bias tempered by, you would hope, some higher appeal to hearing the other side and being objective and being impartial and whatever. The fact that it's become quite propagandistic, certainly on populism, certainly on climate, certainly on other factors as well, and yet it hasn't realised that it's done that. I mean, this is one thing whenever BBC types have a go at GB News, I'm like, whatever else you think about GB News, it knows that it's GB News. The BBC has no idea that it is the left-wing GB News, and that until it gets over that problem, it's not going to be able to rebuild any sense of trust or principle in the way that you're talking about, Benedict, I dare say.